Private sector has often been touted as the key to climate action. Providing her perspective on private sector concerns, Ms. Antonia Yulo-Loyzaga is the president of the National Resilience Council. Over to you po, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Bea. Allow me first to thank the OML Center, UPLB, and the Manila Observatory for inviting us to join this event. Dr. Rex, Dr. Del Lasco, Dr. Rosa, and Dr. John, thank you very much for the presentations. Vice Mayor Coro, Sir Jerome, and Dean Tony and Attorney Gia Ibay. I'm looking forward to discussing these topics further. First of all, I'd like to share the few words that have stood out in terms of the presentations as far as the role of the National Resilience Council in building private sector collaboration. First, the word rapid. The closing window is rapid. And secondly, the irreversible. In some ecosystems, 1.1 degree, 1.5 degree may already have rendered irreversible damage and loss to these ecosystems. The third word is really complex. We're looking here at systemic risk, and Dr. Rosa mentioned this, especially when and as well as Dr. Adele, especially when the hazards compound, the risk cascade, and they also cascade across physical boundaries. The fourth set of terms really that struck me, perhaps because I didn't hear the word intersectionality. And this refers to intersectionality of vulnerability. This is work that is growing, led by Dr. Emma Porio and some others like Dr. Ezra Sean out of Queen's College, looking at intersectionality of vulnerability and how that affects susceptibility. The fourth word is asymmetry, and asymmetry between the impacts we have seen and the adaptive capacity we have also seen played out. So the first imperative for the private sector is really understanding the complexity of risk. And that includes the links between climate action, adaptation mitigation, and disaster risk reduction, specifically in the context, as I've mentioned, of compound hazards, whether they be all climate related, or in fact, combinations of both climatic and non-climatic, as Dr. Adele has mentioned. These hazards can actually result in cascading risk and risk to overall systems and subsystems. This we have already seen in the case of natural technological disasters like we recently experienced in Odette. Once the hazard occurs, basically the physical impact brings technological systems down. The consequent results in terms of the lack of water, the lack of power, and the impacts on health and security are very clear in our experience. As Vice Mayor has said, this happens every year. Most importantly, I think here is where we need to recognize the options for transformational adaptation by looking into the intersectionality of vulnerability, which is really found in our development trajectories, not just in a single disaster event. Place, identities, and characteristics that when combined enhance the inequalities that are already present, possibly due to gender, incomes, age, state of health, nutrition, the quality of the health service delivery system, for example, environmental conditions. These can all increase once combined, once intersected, the susceptibility to harm. And Vice Mayor Coro has very clearly articulated this. The fourth word is asymmetry, and we've seen the impact so far not be matched by what adaptive capacities seem to be in the areas where these impacts have occurred. The warning here is when this asymmetry persists because of maladaptation or the failures in adaptation policies and practice, this could lead to even further disasters. This is already happening, as Dr. Ross has mentioned, in the case, for example, of investing in structural interventions such as seawalls or the straightening of our rivers, which we're very, very, very prone to do in this country. We like to straighten the river with concrete riverways. When in fact, ecosystem-based ridge river reef approaches are available and can enhance the characteristics of these ecosystems to prevent a disaster or mitigate the impacts of hazards. Nature-based solutions can achieve flood protection and, when wisely applied, can address the food, water, energy security outcomes we are all looking for. Loss and damage, while the clearest quantitative indication that there is this asymmetry, need to be also contextualized further in the case of what is beyond the current adaptive capacity of the affected. And that really speaks to the social factors, and Dr. John actually said that, such as the loss of trust within communities or institutions, especially in places where risk is present, along with histories of social-cultural conflict, inequality, social fragility. So for the private sector, the main challenge here is, number one, to step beyond the traditional role of donor in the relief and response when disasters occur. And these types of participation in the post-disaster activities really may only address the immediate and near-term climate risk. Secondly, it needs to recognize that the cost impacts of disruptions to business due to both slow and rapid onset climate-related hazards are actually opportunities to invest in the resilience of natural, human, and engineered systems, which could be vital to the private sector's own survival. This necessarily means that integrating risk, climate risk, as well as other hazards, to the impacts of climate change and other hazards into the core business value cycle. So these are investments then not just on emissions avoidance or reduction of emissions, energy transition towards renewable sources, efficiencies in resource use and pollution management, but towards prevention and preparedness for the kind of hazards that we are going to be facing and have faced beyond the fence lines of business operations. That means looking outside from the business continuity management systems, which only looks at internal capacity to recover and perform essential functions to the business operations, but looking at the communities beyond, the client base beyond, the materials sources beyond. The cost of recovering from major disasters such as Ondoy, Sendong, regionally the floods in Bangkok in 2011, floods and bushfires in Australia, for example, in the Asia Pacific, really has taught us valuable lessons. And here's where the imperatives are. Number one, we need to encourage business in the private sector to support voluntary and mandatory disclosure policies. There is, for example, a regime that has been internationalized by the Bloomberg and other groups that is embodied under the work of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. This should include investments in DRR and adaptation. The sustainability reporting work that is being done by corporations must actually include the work that the work that needs to be done because of this report that has been released. We need to push for balance sheet recognition of formerly intangible assets and liabilities related to the vulnerability, not just of the assets of the business itself, but the impact of these investments on ecosystems and communities that they operate in. So mitigation, adaptation, and DRR now need to be reflected in reporting systems. The central bank has imposed already sustainable finance guidelines for banks. The SEC is reportedly going to make sustainability reporting mandatory in 2023, and the DOF has a regime on green finance. All of these we need to review very closely so that they reflect the findings of this report. The second intervention that needs to be done is to recognize that technological innovation by corporations is not enough. There must be investments in reframing resilience to include not just the protection of business assets, but the conservation and enhancement of socio-ecological systems wherein these businesses operate. We have examples for this, and we work, for example, in Ormoc with EDC Corporation and the Ormoc Local Government Council on these types of projects. This means their investments not just in surveillance, for example, for change detection in the environment, early warning systems, but we also need to look at the support for MSMEs and even the informal livelihoods and enterprises by making financing, knowledge development, and technical services available Typically, MSMEs form part of the supply and value chain of these large corporations, and therefore they should be included in the adaptation program of these corporations. Second to the last would be investments of the private sector should already be made in education, research, and innovation that support transdisciplinary and nexus approaches to governing risk, that these anticipate not just the possible, but the plausible futures and the needs for food, water, and energy security. Lastly, and this is related to Vice Mayor, the private sector needs to be actively involved in building multi-stakeholder partnerships for evidence-informed, inclusive, and adaptive leadership across all levels. And so that has both a horizontal and a vertical challenge to it in terms of coherence and implementation. These partnerships should be driven by shared resilient development goals. And they must be based on the understanding of the complex intersections between human, ecological, economic, infrastructure, and security factors. And on that note, thank you very much once again for this opportunity.